All right, so we seem to have a little trouble remembering how to solve quadratics, so I'm going to do a little video to help with that. So really there's 4 different ways to solve quadratics: by graphing, factoring, completing the square, or using the quadratic formula. Now graphing and quadratic formula, and for the most part completing the square, though it's not always the easiest, can always be used to solve every solvable quadratic equation. Factoring can only be used for ones that can be factored. So I'm not going to go through graphing because there are times that your calculator might be taken away from you, so you can't do it by graphing. So I'm going to review factoring, completing the square, and the quadratic formula. First things first, whenever we're solving, we have to make sure that our equation is equal to 0. So the first thing I need to do is make this equation equal to 0. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So we're going to get x squared minus 11x plus 24 equals 0. So when we're factoring, we need 2 numbers that add to the middle. And if there's no coefficient out front, we need the same 2 numbers to multiply to the number in the end. So we need 2 numbers that add to equal negative 11. And the exact same 2 numbers need to multiply to equal 24. So because our addition is negative and our multiplication is positive, this tells me that both of these numbers are going to be negative. Because a negative plus a negative is a negative, then a negative times a negative gives us a positive. So this will actually get us negative 8, negative 3, and again negative 8, negative 3. So again, when there's no coefficient out front, we can just write as x minus 8, x minus 3, and of course this is equal to 0. So this is the factoring part. Now we have it factored. Now we need to solve. So I need to look at what makes this part equal 0. So what makes x minus 8 equal 0? So in this case, x equals 8. And I need to know what x minus 3, what makes that equal 0? So x equals 3. So there we go. Those are our 2 solutions. So the reason we have to do both of these, because as soon as you make one of these equal 0, well, 0 times anything gives me 0. So there are times when we have coefficients out front. The first thing you always want to check to see if there is a common number that you can factor out. So in this one, there's nothing common between these 3 numbers that I can factor out, because 16 isn't divisible by 3 and 3 isn't divisible by 2. So that means I need to factor right from here, and we can do that because we're already equaling to 0. So it's similar in steps to this, where we still want 2 numbers that add to the middle. So I want 2 numbers that add to negative 16. But now when we multiply, our multiply changes a little bit, and I actually need 2 numbers that multiply to these 2 values multiplied together. So I need to be able to multiply to equal 3 times 12 is negative 36. So we have both of these are negative, which means I'm going to have one negative value, one positive value. So negative 36, so start thinking of some factors of 36. So 6 times 6, that's not going to give us to 16. 8 times 4, not going to get us to 16. 12 and 3, not going to get us to 16. So you just kind of have to go through some different ones and figure out a way to be able to get to 16. So in this case, if we go negative 18, positive 2. Negative 18 plus 2 is negative 16. Negative 18 times 2 is negative 36. So again, because we have this coefficient out front, we can't go right to our answer here. What we need to do is we need to ungroup this like term here. So we're going to keep the 3x squared, and we're going to ungroup this like term. So we're going to go minus 18x plus 2x minus 12, and of course this still equals 0. So now you want to look at each part separately. We're going to factor by grouping. So in these first two terms, I have a 3 that's common that I can factor out, and I have an x that's common that I can factor out. So that leaves us with x minus 6. So then again, I look at the next two. Well, I have a 2 that's common, and that's it. So I can pull out a positive 2. And it leaves me with an x minus 6. So we know we're on the right track when what's inside our brackets is the exact same. So now I can factor out one copy of x minus 6. And that leaves me with 3x plus 2. And then the solving part is exact same as over here. We have to look at each factor separately and solve. So I need to know what is going to make x minus 6 equals 0. Well, that's going to be x equals 6. And I need to know what's going to make 3x plus 2 equals 0. Well, that's going to be negative 2x. So here's our two solutions this time. So factoring without a coefficient and solving, factoring with a coefficient and solving. Usually this is the step that most students forget when you are factoring with a coefficient. So this is solving by factoring. Sometimes there's equations that aren't factorable. So if I try to factor this one, just like I did the last one, I need two numbers that add to the middle, so two numbers that add to be 2, and the same two numbers to multiply to be negative 24. So if I go, well, actually this one is factorable. We go negative 6 and 4. But we're going to pretend it's not factorable. And we're going to instead solve it with the quadratic formula. So even if it is factorable, you can still solve with the quadratic formula. So if I try the quadratic formula, if you remember it, it is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this is what x is going to equal. So in our quadratic formula, this is a, this is b, and this is c. And you want to make sure to keep the signs with the number. So when I sub in, I get negative 2 because of this negative out here, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's going to be 2 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 2, c, which is negative 12, all over 2a. Oops. And of course, we know that a is 2. So that's 2 times 2. So now we can simplify this a little bit. Negative 2 plus or minus the square root. Well, this is going to be 4. Negative and a negative is going to make this a positive. 24, 48, 96, all over 4. So we're going to add x equals negative 2 plus or minus 4 plus 96 is 100. Square root of 100 is 10 over 4. So you can see there's two types of equations we can get. We're going to get one where we have to go negative 2 plus 10 divided by 4, and one where we have to go negative 2 minus 10 divided by 4. So in this version, negative 2 plus 10 is going to be 8. 8 divided by 4 is going to give me 2. Negative 2 minus 10, so remember that's like adding a negative, so that's negative 12. Negative 12 divided by 4 is going to give you negative 3. So because we got these nice clean numbers, that means that it could have been factorable, as we discovered at the beginning. But we can still solve quadratic equation, because quadratic equation works for every type of quadratic, especially if it's in standard form. So there we go. There's the steps for solving using the quadratic formula. I'm just going to zoom out a little bit so we can see all of it. So it's all just about putting the numbers in the correct place in the formula. So the last type is by completing the square. Now I recommend only using that if the completing the square step has already been done, meaning you're already in the vertex form of the equation instead of standard form. So if I want to solve this, it's just like some basic algebra. We're going to add 7 to both sides. So we're going to get 7 equals 3x plus 2 squared. We're going to divide both sides by 3. So I'm going to keep it as a fraction. 7/3 equals x plus 2 squared. Then we need to get rid of the squared. When we square root both sides, you have to be very careful to recognize that this could have been a positive or a negative answer, just like we have the positive and negative here. So it could have been a positive or negative square root of 7/3 that I had. Because positive square root 7/3 squared gives me 7/3, and negative square root of 7/3 squared gives me 7/3. So we have to consider both. So then I got a minus 2 from both sides, minus 2. I tend to like to write this in the front just so it kind of looks in the same form as this. So we're going to have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 7/3 is going to equal our x. So once again, you can see we have two x's. We have x equaling whatever negative 2 plus or minus the square root. Sorry, I just want 1 there. Plus the square root of 7/3. And we have 1 being x equals negative 2 minus the square root of 7/3. So you can leave it like this. This would be an exact value answer. If you have a calculator, you can, of course, actually figure out what the decimal approximation is. So there you have it. There is 3 of the non-graphing ways for solving a quadratic equation. By completing the square, again, I recommend only in vertex form. For quadratic formula, that works for every single type of quadratic in standard form. These ones you would have to rewrite in order to use the quadratic formula. And then, of course, by factoring, either with or without a coefficient.